Hey, I'm at issue 34, and I'm about to learn about one of the hottest topics of this year's symposium, which is, of course, forensic investigative genetic genealogy. Amy and Nicole, thanks for joining me here. To start off with, could you just introduce yourselves and tell me where you're from?
Sure. So I'm Nicole. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, but I know Amy because I was on sabbatical, and I was a visiting scientist at the UNT Center for Human ID.
So I'm Amy Smuts. I am the validation coordinator at the UNT Center for Human ID. So I'm in charge of evaluating and getting online any new kits or instrumentation that are coming in from the laboratory.
Awesome. Have you guys been to ISHE before?
I come every year.
It's been a minute since I've been here, but yes.
Cool. What brings you to this conference? Why do you keep coming back?
For me, I really enjoy the conference itself. I feel like it's a very involved and integrated conference where you really have a great opportunity to interact with the exhibitors and your colleagues from all over the world. And because it is an international conference, we really do get that, diversity of international colleagues coming. And it's always in a fun place, which I absolutely love. So,
yeah, it's fantastic that it is solely focused on DNA so that we can immerse ourselves with our colleagues and learn what everyone else is doing. It's just a fantastic opportunity to network and to, meet people we might not otherwise get to meet and interact with.
You mentioned that it's always in a fun place, and of course we're here in Denver this year for issue 34. Have you done anything fun in Denver while you've been here?
I did go up a couple of mountains, and I will say that the altitude has gotten the best of me a little bit this week.
It's no joke, right?
I'm finally starting to feel better, and I'm like, and I leave tomorrow, so great. But yeah, the scenery is really beautiful. I know that not everybody had the luxury to go outside of Denver, but I did come in a little bit early to take some time to explore, and I can't wait to do the same in San Antonio next year and all the years to come. So yeah, amazing time so far.
I haven't had an opportunity to explore much. I'm hoping to be able to possibly do that on Thursday after the conference ends, but because I'm excited to kind of see the city a little bit more outside of our little bubble here.
For sure. We get a lot of time looking at, the convention center, the hotel where the general session is. But it's nice to get out a little bit and see Denver. It's a lovely city, so I'm glad that you're taking a little bit of time. And of course, tonight we're going to be at a reception at the Museum of Nature and Science, so that should be a great time.
I find the reception is always the best part, and no disrespect to the speakers because we're speakers, and I really hope that people enjoyed our talk. But everybody is a little bit more settled in and comfortable by the Wednesday night event, and everybody lets a little bit more loose, I guess. And so I'm very excited to have some great conversations later today.
I just want to see the museum.
It should be a great time, yes. So you mentioned that you're both speakers this year. Can you tell me what it is you're presenting on, or you presented this morning actually? What did you talk about at the general session?
So Amy and I split our talk. We talked about essentially what it means to bring genetic genealogy online in a lab and exploring three main chemistries. So Amy's really been at the helm in terms of doing a ton of the bench work for the Kintelligence, so the targeted sequencing, and then the GSA, so like the SNP arrays. And then I was at the bench doing a lot of the whole genome developmental validation work. And we just kind of brought all of our work together to share with the community. If you are wanting to bring genealogy online in your public lab or in your private lab, these are the major considerations that should be at the forefront of your decision making.
That sums it up.
I want to pause you for a second though before we get too far into this. What is genetic genealogy? Can you explain that to begin with?
So it is applying the genealogical process, so researching your family tree, finding out who you're related to, taking that and applying it to DNA data, essentially. So in cases where we have an unknown sample that we've put into CODIS that has not had a hit to it, so it's just sitting there unknown, we haven't been able to make an identification in a case, then once that sample has been in CODIS for a bit, then we can use investigative or forensic genetic genealogy to then sort of take that sample, enter it into an appropriate DNA database, do some searching and see if we can find any relatives to that sample, and then sort of take that information, build a family tree, narrow it down to a potential person of interest, and then sort of go on from there.
So you mentioned, beginning with CODIS, moving into these other databases. CODIS, of course, has millions of samples and profiles. When we start, looking at these other databases to do the more genealogical work, how much are we expanding our sample and our profile base by at that point?
That's a little tricky because CODIS is governed, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, and typically with genetic genealogy, at least at this point, from everything I know, and maybe there are trade secrets I don't know, but those are more public databases. And so we're really relying on a variety of users to put their own samples into those databases to enrich our ability to search versus, of course, CODIS being regulated for convicted offenders or arrestees or whoever the key perpetrators are that have been uploaded into those secure databases. So again, to Amy's point, just using genealogical approaches as that secondary tool. We still need to do our traditional STR typing, and if that can easily answer the question, then there's no need to go to the next step, right? And not forgetting that we can use STRs to solve a lot of our casework, but having the luxury, I guess, of genetic genealogy as our next step if the case is going to go unsolved.
It's all about having more tools in your toolbox, right? To find the answers you're looking for. This is a really hot topic this year. It's all the way up and down the agenda, and so many of the interviews that we're doing here, it gets referenced. It's a fairly new technique, right? Why is it so hot right now?
I think just because everybody's doing it. Everybody is wanting to solve those cases that have been sitting for a long time. Amy, what are your thoughts?
I mean, same. So I think it's sort of opening up, like you said, our toolbox, and giving us more avenues to explore these old or cold cases that have no resolution. I mean, it's just giving us an opportunity to go back, re-look at those cases, and give us an opportunity to potentially solve them.
Awesome. Yeah. All about the tools. So you mentioned, that your talk was about the approaches to actually incorporating this in your lab. What are some of those considerations that you told the audience about? What do we need to keep in mind when we're bringing this tool into our toolbox?
Well, we did talk a little bit about cost. Cost is definitely going to be the driver for a lot of labs, especially the public labs. At the CHI, we are in a very fortunate position where we had all of the instrumentation to perform these different validations, but that's not going to be true for most labs. So maybe one lab only has like the MySeq or the S5 as the desktop sequencer, or maybe they only have the iScan for doing array data. And then we talked about the NovaSeq for whole genome, but that's $1 million instrument. So that is really not going to be people's necessary first choice. But if they have access to it, or if they bring one of those online, these are the things that you can do. And cost was really one important consideration, but also workflow and throughput. And do you have a big lab where you have hundreds of cases that are sitting unsolved, or do you have a small operation, you have maybe a dozen, and it might be cheaper to outsource? All of the things I think to consider.
You mentioned that you were doing a lot of the bench work and the developmental validation for this. What are some of the biggest things that you learned, or things that surprised you while doing that validation work?
Ooh, that's a good one for Amy.
That is a good question. I mean, one of the big hurdles that we are finding ourselves having to jump over is just the availability of samples to perform these validations with. It's because with the whole genome and with some of the microarray technologies, we are talking about some personal health information that is being generated. So sometimes people are not willing to have their data used for those purposes. They don't know how that data is being stored, how secure it is. I mean, we have made every effort possible on our end to secure that data and make sure that nothing happens to it. So I mean, I would say sample acquisition is one of the big things that we've had to overcome. I mean, it's just, honestly, it's been interesting from a validation perspective to be able to look at these three different technologies, look at the differences between them, see what the pros and cons are, to see, and hopefully help other labs try to figure out what is going to be most appropriate for them to implement.
You briefly maybe reference this, but anytime we have a new technology or a new tool, there are going to be conversations about how do we make sure that we're using this effectively, appropriately, and responsibly. And that's definitely something that, is ongoing with this work. It's a lot of the conversations happening here at ISHE. Can you just tell me a little bit about some of those conversations that we're having about making sure that we're using this tool responsibly?
And that is one of the big conversations that we've had in our laboratory, because, right, we don't want to, this is an incredible tool that can be used by a lot of different laboratories for a lot of different purposes to solve a lot of cases. And ultimately that's our goal, is to solve these cases. But we do have to watch ourselves and make sure that we're being appropriate in how we're handling the data, how we're handling the samples, just to make sure that we're not ruining it for everyone else. And we would hope that everyone else has the courtesy to do that as well. There have been a lot of things in the news about people maybe skirting the rules. One of the problems that we're facing now is that there really aren't any concrete guidelines available for how to do this and how to use this tool. So that is one thing that we are making sure that we are following the Department of Justice interim guidelines for FIGG searching. We're making sure we adhere to that, and we hope that everyone else is doing the same.
And from the validation standpoint, our informed consent process throughout the entire validations has been very strict. And so really making sure that any volunteers are very aware of what's happening and very aware of the scope of how their samples will be used. And the same isn't necessarily true when it comes to casework, because oftentimes you might have unidentified human remains and that's all you have, and you're hoping for some resolution. So at the forefront here, really being very strict about how we're processing our samples so that, to Amy's point, like putting our best foot forward and not ruining it for anybody else by being overly ethical or being overly considerate of all of the moving parts. So when it is finally implemented in casework, it's a well-oiled machine, and it's also a machine that still instills that public trust, right? Because public trust is fundamental for forensic genetics, and when we lose it, I mean, all bets are off in terms of our careers, and that's a scary thought. So really just always, doing the right thing.
That trust is definitely critical for any forensic DNA work, but definitely when we're looking into new techniques and new tools, certainly in the public, but also something I'm curious about is in the courtroom. We're still having conversations about the use of DNA in the courtroom. What do we know so far about how this tool is being treated in that space?
I feel like it's flip-flopped a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, not a lot. There haven't been very many cases gone to court yet. So that's still sort of a question mark. And one of the things that we've been focusing on too, and trying to impart to everyone else, is that FIGG is an investigative tool. So it is sort of an interim step, going from after we develop a profile for an unknown sample, an STR profile, put that in CODIS, then that next step into the FIGG, that is an investigative lead. That is providing information for then a genealogist to come in, go build some family trees, find a potential person of interest, and then after that interim portion, they find a person of interest. We will then confirm that person of interest with STR testing. So we're kind of bringing it full circle, but right, initially, most of the proponents of this were saying that this would never be introduced in court because it is just simply an investigative tool. But I think that's definitely going to change.
I would agree.
Yeah, and probably fairly soon, as more of these cases start getting solved and going to court, that is going to be an issue that we have to figure out how to navigate.
And I think we're kind of already there. I think in discovery it comes up a little bit. Was genealogy used, and then explaining how it was used, and then what steps we we then took after we had a person of interest. And, you know, traditional STR typing is robust and validated and accepted, but again, it only is one piece of the puzzle of an investigation, or I hope it should only be one piece of a puzzle in the investigation. And remembering that while DNA is super powerful and informative, it doesn't tell the whole story all of the time. And remembering, you know, the perspective or the lens for which we're utilizing DNA in any ongoing investigation, I think is really, really critical. And genealogy is giving us that opportunity to re-educate the public on DNA use and DNA methods that can be employed for solving cases.
So as with anything, we're establishing the applications and the benefits, but also, you know, figuring out for ourselves where the limitations are. Is that kind of what you would say?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary.
Cool. So the last thing I want to ask you before we wrap up here is, you know, in your work to you know, to figure out how to adopt this in labs, to guide other labs for how to adopt it, what's the next steps, or what's the future for you? You know, where do you hope to go in the short and medium term?
I'll start with the developmental and then I'll move over to the internal. But my role in the grand scheme of implementation has really been at the beginning. So that developmental validation of the new chemistry or technology. And we've utilized a chemistry that's available from Illumina. We've pushed the limits of the chemistry to see, like, how low can we go, because that's always a question in forensics in terms of sensitivity. And then we've tried that chemistry on a variety of platforms to, again, see where the limit is, or what type of data we can generate when considering what labs will have access to. And typically the developmental validation is the first thing. And then when it moves into the lab for the internal, we often refer to the developmental validation as that foundation to then set up our internal validations.
And so then, right, once we transition to our internal or implementation validation, my hope is just that we can, right, use the foundation that they have built for us. By doing that developmental validation, we can then take the necessary parts, apply that, and get this up and running in our laboratory just to see how these tools can function for us.
And I think every lab is going to look a little different in terms of how they implement a new chemistry, and then again how their instruments perform, because we've seen, you know, you've got two instruments side by side and sometimes they give you slightly different end results, not in the conclusions, but just in the overall performance, and understanding again how all of those pieces fit together so that when you submit that report either to the investigators or the attorneys, that you are confident in everything that's inside, and so, you know, everything is working as it should.
Awesome. Well, very exciting work. Thank you so much for sharing with me. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.